à toutes et à tous et bienvenue pour cette deuxième journée de notre séminaire Reconnaissance et catégorisation des langues minorisées. On va commencer cette session de communication qui est sur la transmission des langues minorisées, minorées, avec différents terrains à travers le monde. Et on commence avec un terrain australien. Et Denise va nous faire une présentation qui se nomme Renaissance, reconnaissance et maintien, les multiples facettes de la transmission dans les contextes linguistiques autochtones minoritaires en Australie. Denise est professeure à l'Université nationale australienne à Canberra. Donc, elle nous fait l'honneur d'être avec nous aujourd'hui, même s'il est très tard pour elle. Donc, merci beaucoup, Denise, et on écoute ta présentation avec grand plaisir.
Thank you very much, and I do hope that people will bear with me as I present in English. I'm sorry, neither my French nor Portuguese are up to anything much else. Here's the title. So we're talking about revival, recognition or maintenance, and where I want to take you through some of the multiple facets of transmission in different contexts of minoritised Indigenous languages in Australia. So just as an overview, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background to the Australian context, because I'm assuming that many people won't know that. And then we're going to look at very briefly at three case studies of different language ecologies, and I'll conclude. Okay, so just as an introduction, we have two groups, big cultural groups, broad cultural groups in Australia: Aboriginal people, and the vast majority of the Australian continent, and Torres Strait Islander people in the Torres Strait to the northeast there. They have been in place in their country for millennia, but they weren't really known in Europe till around the 1770s, although there had been a few encounters a bit earlier than that. However, there were sort of contacts with the Macassans of Sulawesi in the north of Australia, in present day, that's from present day Indonesia. Indigenous societies in Australia were small, highly sophisticated and complex, and with an orientation to being multilingual, and their economies were hunter-gatherer, which required an incredibly profound knowledge of country. In terms of language, pre-colonisation, here's a map showing traditional languages, and you can see the diversity here. So around 400 distinct languages were spoken, and they were in place for thousands of years. And these languages have not been shown to be related to any other languages in the world, with the exception of Miriam, which is in the far northeast, which is a Papuan language. So culturally, these languages belong in the country, they're anchored there and stay there regardless of any proficiency of their speakers or their language community. And these are oral languages, so they're spoken and sung and enacted. So there's an orature, I suppose I'd say, rather than a literature. They're able to express all necessarily cultural knowledges and ecological knowledges of Indigenous people. Now, since colonisation, well, let's start from colonisation. So Captain James Cook in 1770 claimed Australia for England, so we became a colony. And the first colony was a convict colony in Sydney in 1788. And these first contacts were really devastating for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who were persecuted, controlled and exploited. And the Darug people of Sydney, they've experienced this occupation for about 250 years. But this time depth varies throughout Australia. So, for example, we have a Pintabee family from exiting from the desert in 1984. And this really changed this difference in time depth of occupation really has a profound effect on languages today. By about the 1970s, some of the worst aspects of colonial control of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people started being dismantled. And so there's a heap of results or effects of this history, and the change in the linguistic landscape is just one of these. So if we look at today at the population of Australia, we're up to about 27 million inhabitants, and mostly these are in capital cities on the coast, and Indigenous Australians are only a very small percentage of the population. But if you look in the bottom map, this is about the percentage of Indigenous people, you can see that in some parts of Australia, like in the urban zones, they're a very small minority in their own countries. But in other parts, in the more remote areas, they are the majority, often 100%. And in those remote locations, people are often living in very small communities, maybe each community with a different language, often. And often they're very small, like it's in about 1,000 people in the communities. So here's a map of the current present day linguistic situation. You can see in the dotted area, you can see that we have some places where a traditional language is spoken as a first language. English gets added to their repertoires. Some places, the cross-hatching up the north, that's where a contact language is spoken as a first language and the traditional is learned in addition, as well as English. And then finally, the biggest area with the sort of slanted stripes, that's where English is spoken as a first language, maybe an indigenised variety of English, and traditional Indigenous languages are learnt as a second language. So if we're going to talk about the transmission of minoritised Indigenous languages, we do actually have to spend a small moment thinking about the types of Indigenous languages, if we mean by that those languages that are spoken predominantly by Indigenous people, because we have the traditional Indigenous languages that were spoken pre-colonisation. Then we've got new contact languages, which are like mixed languages or Creoles. And then we've got varieties of English. And in there, as well as the standard, which is the mainstream in the dominant sort of society, we also have Indigenous varieties there. So there's new post-colonisation as well as traditional. So if we're thinking about the traditional languages, well, they come with a sort of automatic high status, cultural status amongst Indigenous people. But they are still minoritised because it's really rare that the dominant society, English speaking, actively supports these languages in any meaningful, consistent way. But there's two different situations. We have the first spoken, where it's spoken as a first language, so it being maintained within the family, and often it's the main language in the community, which assists with that maintenance. Or there's the second revival situation, where it's not automatic that people learn their traditional language. And there's a really broad range of situations here, largely revolving around how accessible the traditional target language is to would-be learners. Now, just before we leave the new languages, I just want to sort of cover a few things about them because they're part of the language ecology in which all of this language learning is taking place. So they are typically transmitted within the family and with an Indigenous language community. And they've got distinctive local varieties, so it's an expression of identity and local identity. But when it comes to the dominant, society attitudes, they're not valued, and often they're seen as poor versions of English and that sort of thing. So in terms of this kind of minoritisation, it raises questions about recognition, and then once recognised, what the community aspires to do with these languages, because they're not in the same cultural category as the traditional languages. Particularly for the contact languages, there's an issue about being the minoritisation excluding speakers from essential services, because they're not recognised. So I'm going to move now to the 3 case studies, and we're going to have one in an area where a traditional language is spoken as a first language by everybody, one in a situation where it's a contact language, a Creole, spoken by everybody, so the traditional language is being added as a second language, and one where we're looking at English being the language of the Indigenous community, and they're reviving their language, their traditional language as a second language. So let's start with the maintenance situation, and this is for the traditional language, Warlpiri, spoken there in the centre of Australia. So the Warlpiri have actually 4 main communities in the Tanami Desert, which are Warlpiri speaking, with about all up 2,500 speakers in the recent census. And they've got this long history of engaging with bilingual education, which has been financed on and off by the Northern Territory government for, since about the 1970s, maximally for 25 schools, about that number. There's less at the moment currently because it's a bit of a political plaything, to be honest. But the Warlpiri people have really fought for their bilingual program. There's many reasons. For example, it's a source of employment on the basis of having high proficiency in Warlpiri. It's about having status for Warlpiri at the school, pushing back on that minoritised status. And it's about developing literacy for the community in Warlpiri, which is really very rare for Indigenous languages in Australia. And here's an example. You can see the cover of a book that was produced by Warlpiri women on a cultural topic of importance to them. So if we just think a little bit more about or learn a bit more about bilingual education, the way that bilingual education has worked for Warlpiri and in the Northern Territory is it revolves around literacy. And so there's a focus on first language literacy, and which gradually transitions into sort of English after about 5 years of schooling. But it's also an opening for Warlpiri people to develop their own curriculum with subjects that are of cultural importance to them. So here's an example of their Warlpiri theme cycle. So in the first year, 4 different topics that they've selected, the second year another 4 that they've added, and a third year another 4 topics. And the importance of this is that it's, again, pushing back on that minoritisation of their cultural knowledges within the school system. Another aspect of the Warlpiri bilingual program has been concentrating on strong Warlpiri. So the kinds of Warlpiri that were traditionally spoken and that maybe focus on specialised or less frequent topics that children won't otherwise acquire automatically in their current, sort of community settings. And at the same time, it's also about, sort of instrumentalising Warlpiri so that they're growing the domains in which it's being used via being represented in the school. And the other thing that's really interesting is that the Warlpiri people have actually put aside a special fund to keep supporting Warlpiri culture and education. Now we're going to move to Yarrabah community, where the Creole is a first language. And so Yarrilingo is the name of the Creole, and Gungai Yidin is the name of the traditional language, which is being revived. So when we look at Yarrilingo, this is a matter of recognising the traditional language. The community has a history of being a government mission, and the government brought Indigenous people from other areas to Yarrabah. And as a result, we had about 40 different traditional languages, as well as a number of different contact languages represented in the community. And also the children were housed in dormitories. And for these circumstances, because of these circumstances, a Creole developed. Now, I'll just take one small issue for Creole languages in Australia. New Creoles, for example, they're not automatically recognised. And one reason is that they have no name. So they're invisible to governments and invisible to government processes such as census. And so this leads to a great injustice because speakers have less access through their own language to education, health, justice, financial things, because these are all delivered to them in English. Bernadine Yateman, a local educator and researcher, has led a lot of projects to try and raise awareness about Yarrilingo. And an example I want to show you is this poster that she developed about how we talk here, at Yarrabah. And it was really effective project because it really drove long-term discussions about the language contrasting with English. And I suppose most importantly, it gave the community a sense that this was a real language because the history was explained. They learned about other Creoles in other parts of the world, and it really sort of raised pride in the local situation. But on the flip side, we also have the traditional language. And it isn't being spoken currently because of the history that I just explained, because it was disrupted by the mission. But we do have some families outside of the mission, and so the change, the shift in language use was a bit later, and they have a little bit more language knowledge. And so community memory and some documentation, linguistic documentation, have been harnessed when Bernardine created an initiative in the school with the community to teach the traditional language. It was decided it would be the language of the country there, but it was a complex question because, as I explained, there's a lot of different linguistic affiliations in Yarrabah. Here's pictures of the teacher Nathan Schreiber, Indigenous educator who's taken on that role, and he conducted his own personal research as well as formal studies in linguistics and teaching language teaching. And so now with a local community group, consultation group, he's teaching Gungai Yidin at the school. One of the issues that they're sort of pondering at the moment is about, yes, the school program is going very well, but how is that sort of then, this knowledge now transmitted more effectively or increased back into the community? And then finally, I wanted to talk about a situation where in Sydney, where we have English as the major language, for some people perhaps an Indigenised variety, and we're revitalising Darug, the local language. So I explained earlier that Darug people were, it was their lands in which the first English colony was based, and this generated a very rapid language shift. And because of the era in which that occurred, we don't have any audio recordings and no speakers of this language. And so that means that oral transmission is not possible because the community is actually working at rebuilding itself. So in essence then, transmission is via a number of written archival documents, which it's necessary to analyse and interpret. You trust me on that one. So nowadays, Darug people are a small minority in their own country, and Darug activists are thinking about how to reconstruct their language. Their aspiration is to be able to interact and communicate in their own language, and they realise it's going to be, that's a long journey. So they're doing their own personal research with the community as well as more formal education. And they've decided that they want to share their language with everybody. Most important, of course, with their own community, Darug community, but with other people who live in Sydney as well. And so their focus is on learning and teaching of Darug. And to that end, they're doing a lot of work of developing resources like a grammatical description and like a series of learner guides like this beautiful one here, and also a dictionary as well. Okay, so in terms of the kind of initiatives that they've got happening for growing a community, regrowing a community, they've done formal education, the Master of Indigenous Languages education at Sydney Uni, and that's given them a foundational knowledge in teaching languages and in linguistics. And with that, they have developed and delivered a community language course at the moment to over 900 participants. And that course has actually inspired quite a lot of people who, Darug people, to learn more and to, consider teaching. They've also formed a group, a community group that's leading, the production of learning and teaching materials, and also, working with linguists to help with the reconstruction of their language. It's a focus on schools, which has been led by Jasmine Seymour. She's developed our curriculum and teaching and learning materials, and she does modelling and also mentoring of teachers as well, Darug teachers, and that's happening in 21 schools this year, an idea of the scale. And last year, for the first time, Darug was taught at a university level. And this is quite an achievement, really, because there's only, as far as we can work out, maybe 3 other Indigenous languages in revival setting that are being taught in Australian universities at the moment. Now, there's many sides of this, but one gorgeous side is the beautiful, a creative side that you can see through some of Jasmine's beautiful children's books. And one of the interesting things you can see is that the quotient of Darug language that she is using grows over the years. So at first it was kind of cultural content, and then individual vocabulary words, and then now whole sentences and through stories as well. Okay, so in conclusion, right, what I hope is that I've illustrated that the idea of transmission for minoritized Indigenous languages has all different faces depending on the ecology in which they exist, which their efforts exist. We've got our first, when we saw a first language, traditional language speaking situation, and we saw that the intergenerational transmission was happening sort of automatically within Indigenous contexts, but the community was really focused on keeping the school domain there, which is not seen as an Indigenous domain at all, to sort of reinforce transmission, but also there's a status issue that wanted to gain that for their children. We looked at a situation of an Indigenous contact language, Creole, and where the traditional language was being acquired as a second language. And we saw how important it was that although the transmission was occurring automatically of the contact language, again, in Indigenous contexts, the challenge was of recognition to achieve some form of linguistic justice, for speakers. And in terms of the traditional language in this situation, the idea was to improve or to augment that partial transmission that was happening in currently, prior to the school program in Indigenous contexts, by adding the school program. And that sort of augmented some of the sources, some of the memories in the community, and sort of was driving a sort of increase of transmission in the school zone at the moment. They're wanting to move into the community more. And then finally, we looked at a situation where it really was reconstructing from archival sources. And here, the transmission has been by necessity through written documents, and the community is using those with research and teaching and learning to build a community which will be able to then transmit their language orally again. And so what I hope has been somewhat clear in this race through of different situations is that the language ecology is so important to consider, because it determines community priorities and needs, and the methods they're using, and also what would be appropriate, useful research. And we're hoping in the project that we've been doing, we're hoping that the language ecologies will help steer policy. We think it's got profound policy implications. And just for example, that really we need to have appropriate differentiation to support Indigenous language activists. So thank you for listening to me, have references and acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. I'm going to open the floor for questions. Est-ce que quelqu'un a des questions à poser à Denise ou des réflexions? Sinon, si vous n'en avez pas pour l'instant, moi j'en ai, donc je vais commencer. Thank you so much, Denise. Fascinating as always. I just had a few questions. At some point, you talked about the recognition of the Creoles, and I was wondering how was the ongoing dialogue with the state? Because yesterday we talked a lot about the situation in Angola, and we discussed how difficult it was to actually establish a dialogue. Also, due to their history, they went through many things quite recently, and so are there an ongoing dialogue? Is it working quite well? Would you say, is there maybe good practices that could be, that we could take from you and put into place maybe somewhere else?
Oh, I wish I could say that there were good practices. I think tenacity on the part of different, Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people has really been the key. And often when they have been able to form, how would I call it, like teams of people who can see the issues. So sometimes that involves educators or linguists, or sometimes, policy people, sometimes it involves church, actually. And so it's not been a simple recipe. And our issue has been that Creole languages get sandwiched between traditional languages which have a kind of cultural gravitas, and English, which is seen as the mainstream languages, getting entree into so many areas, that Creoles don't seem to get a place in either area. So we've been really pushing to try and find some openings to say Indigenous languages include Creoles, for example, as well as Indigenised Englishes. There's a number of things that just get left out of the conversation. And we've been trying to work on the idea of an ecology. I'm not entirely certain. I think in Australia this might be too complicated. We thought it would be easy, but it hasn't been. But that's one. And the other thing is making a team. We have a team, you just might have seen it briefly in the acknowledgements, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from different language ecologies, and they're learning much more about each other's, and I think they're going to be great advocates for not leaving anybody out. Do you know what I mean? I think getting voices and people with experiences educated. One of the interesting things in the fact that people are looking to schools, I think, is that we are hoping that that might be a lever for encouraging more awareness about different language situations. We might be able to use a bit of the curriculum there. Have to wait and see.
Okay, thank you. Just a follow-up question, because you were mentioning that there are like 3 languages that are taught at uni level. Sorry, including Darug. Are there talks to include like some more, and including maybe Creoles?
Okay, that was 3 languages, 3 others apart from Darug, and these are the ones that are in a revival setting. And there are a couple more that are stronger languages that have been 3 more that I know of off the top of my head. So yeah, that's not many when you look at that whole map, and 400, is it? So it hasn't been, it's not been well supported, which is why I was indicating that I would, one of the reasons that we could call these minoritized languages. So it is not possible to attend school all the way in any Indigenous language, and there's very limited possibilities for studying them. Don't want to sound too negative, but it's not jolly, as you can imagine.
Ok, thank you. Are there remarks, or est-ce qu'il y a, des questions ou des remarques dans la salle? No? Okay. So I'm going to ask my last question then. Do you manage, like, for the languages you're working on any other language, do you manage to have a unified like grammar, lexicon, quite, I wouldn't dare say easily, but how would you say are the talks in the community? Are there like some, I don't know, like some ideas of what they want to, what they want to create?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We work with people who are highly active in their languages, and they have ideas, so many ideas. We, for example, with Darug, as I've mentioned, there's so many things on the agenda at the moment, a grammar, like a teaching grammar. We've got learners' guides, we've got community lessons, school lessons, and we have a regular working party where we meet. Everybody is now totally comfortable with archival documents and wacky handwriting and wacky translations, and it's just awesome work. Yeah, so we're very fortunate in so many settings to have such how would I put it? Just such joyful and enthusiastic and really committed people to work with.
Ok, merci beaucoup, Denise.